It was a vast improvement. I'm curious, listening to a lot of the themes he was talking about, whether Jon Meacham, a man who's sitting right now, at the birthplace of Jacksonian democracy, if you didn't see some parallels, a guy running against the moneyed interests, a guy running against the Washington establishment, a guy who's saying, hey, they're for themselves, I'm with you. Whether you don't see some parallels of the guy that you studied quite a bit, Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, absolutely. Trump is speaking the classic language of American populism, which, as you say, really began in the 1820s. Jackson was the first person to really use this in a popular way, the phrase corrupt bargain. He was talking about a rigged system, about political insiders picking presidents a long time before they were talking about it with Sanders and Trump and all of that. So that vernacular, which was set almost 200 years ago now, is clearly in play here. One of the things that I think is really interesting that you've talked about and written about a lot, and I'd love to hear you on this, is there were really two messages there, at least, right? There's the classic anti-Clinton message, which I must say, for 25 years, conservatives in America have run against the Clintons on issues of character and that sort of thing, and it hasn't really worked out. I mean, you got a two-term Democratic president out of it, and now the first female nominee of a major party. But then that second part that we ran about thinking small, that's resonant. There is a sense that there was a destiny, there was a national greatness. We sent men to the moon, and then we have thought less largely and more dramatically. And that's a message that I think if Trump were to stick with the second one, perhaps less than the first one, that could perhaps grow a general election number.
Jon Meacham, you can go ahead and you can scat the way he's been scatting over the past 9 months to a year, but you also have to be able to read a teleprompter. You also have to be able to deliver a message, and that's exactly what he did yesterday. And the game has changed, and he has to change with it. I just want to finish what I was saying. One, you've got to get past the disqualifying remarks in the past, and then two, you can open yourself up to people about rebuilding America and saying more than just making America great, but talking about how you're going to do that. I mean, that's his two-step challenge, John.
Well, I think the rebuilding America message, which is different than making America great again to some extent, it's a more mainstream message, it seems to me, is probably his best path forward. I don't know if it's going to be a sufficient path, but at least it's moving away from, respectfully to Donnie, yes, his authenticity has been his selling card, but he's authentic from second to second. And at one moment, he'll say what he thinks, and then a second moment later, when challenged, he'll reverse it. So being authentic he's just been inconsistent. And so the real question, since he's now the nominee of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, Eisenhower, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan, is he going to say what he means and mean what he says? And if it's going to be the guy yesterday, that's a more plausible president than the fella who's been charming us and mesmerizing us all these months.
Hey, Jon Meacham, off of what Kristen was just telling us, the underpinnings of these polls, we are in the equivalent, I think, of about the 7th inning of a 9-inning game. I mean, it's almost July. And yet despite Donald Trump's, performance yesterday, standing up and reading the teleprompter, he still has a lack of mechanical aspects in a campaign that we've all become used to, including like the sabermetrics of campaigning now, identifying voters in specific states. So what happens to a Trump campaign where it's so flimsy beneath the performance that we saw yesterday?
Yeah, it's one of the great risks. You put your finger on it. From what we can tell, there's some chaos over up the street a little bit at Trump Tower, and they're trying to put this together quickly. It's hard to put together a huge national operation sort of on the fly in a couple of months. This has been driven by this incredible cult of personality of Trump. To a large measure, as we've all remarked on for months now, it's been run, and to some extent, with his getting up in the morning, looking at papers, watching the shows, tweeting, then dominating the news cycle, going to these rallies where people are bringing their, bringing kids. They're incredibly emotional. But the arenas don't necessarily get you a general election win. So I think I hate this phrase, but I'll use it. I think the ground game is a hugely important thing. President Obama, both in 08 and 12, spent an enormous amount of time turning out new voters, which made a critical difference. And what we can clearly tell, I think, what we just said about race to the bottom, unquestionably this is going to be a race to the bottom. And the question, as you're raising, is does he have the infrastructure to run a professional campaign to November?
That's a guy who knows about Jackson's ground game.
Yes, he does.
I like to say, Mike, it takes, the 45% of the vote you get as a major party nominee is kind of baked in.
Right. Yeah.
It's the next 5% that costs $500 million. And that's the problem for Donald Trump. He can do well as a campaigner, as a speechmaker, but to go out and find those swing voters who aren't very engaged, who are indifferent, who are not very partisan in the usual way, takes a lot of money and effort. It's hard.
And they're not white men.
Yes.
And that's why those FEC reports from last week were so devastating, or from, I think, earlier this week, showing that he only had 1.3 million cash on hand. During the primary, Donald Trump got about $2 billion or so in what folks have estimated is kind of free media. So he can tweet his way to the media side of things, but you can't tweet your way to the ground game side of things. And whether it's building the kind of voter file and data operation you need to target voters, or getting actual people on the ground, field offices, that's something that Democrats are really good at. They've been much better at it than Republicans in recent election cycles, and without enough money in the bank, gas in the tank, how will Donald Trump be able to match that? I think that's really unclear.
And the Trump campaign would point out they raised $5 or $6 million over the last day or so. Long way to go, obviously, though. Kristen Soltis Anderson, thanks so much. John, I know you have to go get in line at Pancake Pantry. We'll let you go. Okay? Good luck. All right.